Good day, my fellow Canadians. So let's take stock for a second. Mark Carney, the unelected Prime Minister of Canada, is throwing shade at Pierre Poilievre. Again, why? Because Poilievre won't submit himself to a government security clearance. Carney called it irresponsible, even dangerous, in the era of foreign interference. This is rich coming from a guy that won't disclose his financial holdings, helped broker a $250 million deal with the Bank of China, and somehow expects us to believe he's a beacon of national security. Let's be clear. If Poilievre did accept that security clearance, he'd be forbidden from speaking publicly about what he learns. That's right. The leader of the official opposition would be legally gagged from criticizing the government's handling of foreign interference in the middle of an election. That's not security. That's political sabotage disguised as patriotism. Meanwhile, Carney's ethics file is still sealed tighter than his carbon tax map. Blind trusts, undisclosed assets, and vague answers from a man who spent more time in boardrooms than constituencies. How many conflicts of interest are we talking about here? We don't know, because he won't tell us. And while all of that's unfolding, Tom McClare, the former leader of the NDP, came out swinging this week and basically said, there's only two choices in this election, Conservatives or Liberals. Not exactly a vote of confidence for Jagmeet Singh, whose party is polling in the single digits and whose I'm Fighting For You ad campaign has all the authority of a federal rebate, which brings us to today's episode. Joining us today is someone who's actually seen the NDP from the inside, Julien Newman, former staffer, strategist, and one of the few people willing to speak honestly about what the hell's happened to Canada's third party. Julien, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me on.
For those who might not know the full story, remind us, who are you and how do you end up inside the belly of the NDP beast?
Yeah, I started being a volunteer for the NDP when I was 12 years old. I don't even think I was allowed to be a member yet, but I volunteered for campaigns. In high school, I would go every day after school to volunteer on the Ed Broadbent campaign, which is how I first met Jack Layton. And when I graduated high school and I was 18, I went to work for Jack, and I worked right beside him. My office was, right beside his office in the NDP leader's office. I worked with Jack for many years. I worked for almost 10 years at the NDP's headquarters, where I was responsible for Quebec, mostly under Jack. And then I was very close to Tom Mulcair, and I headed operations nationally for him. So I was really, my early career was all working for the NDP. I'm an entrepreneur now, so I kind of, one of the advantages of starting to work in politics when you're so young, when you're 18, is that I kind of, by the time I was like 26, I had worked there for 10 years, and I kind of moved on and started a whole new career as an entrepreneur in Silicon Valley. And you and I connected, Dan, because I hadn't been active in Canadian politics for close to 10 years. And the NDP was making a massive mistake. The mistake they were making is that we were headed into a trade war with the United States, which we're in now. We knew we were headed into a trade war. We had no functional government, just like we don't now. We knew we would have no functional government. And there was only one person who was able to fix that, which was Jagmeet. He could call an election in December, and we wouldn't have any of the problems we have now. And I came together with some of the most senior people in the NDP, not current people, like former people. And we tried to pressure Jagmeet into calling an election, both internally, but also publicly. Obviously, we were not successful. And we are where we are. So that's kind of my, my background. I think right now, I'm still an NDP member. I'm still an NDP supporter and volunteer. I go door to door regularly for my local candidate. So I'm a hardcore New Democrat and have been for all my life.
And just so everyone's listening at home, they need to understand that I'm apolitical. I'm all about calling out the swamp. I'm not about fanboying for Pierre Poilievre. I think they have their own problems. So, it's great to have you here talking to us because, obviously the NDP has its own swamp and they've essentially abandoned the working class. And, back when Leighton was leader, he represented, the middle class, the working class. He seemed like he was your neighbor. And let me ask you a question, Julien. How did the Party of the People, the NDP, get completely outflanked by the Conservatives on working class issues?
One of the strange things about the left, but it's not even the left, it's just like politics in Canada in general, is that it was taken over by an ideology that's not left or right. It's a big government ideology. And that has nothing to do with being left wing, has nothing to do with being right wing. It's just its own thing. And it was very much like a thing of the boomers, right? So I grew up with this woman, like my parents bought a home with her and we kind of like grew up in the same house. This woman who's named Madeleine Parent. If you just go on like Canada Post, you can see there's a Canada Post stamp of her. She's kind of like this iconic kind of like leader of the labor movement in Canada. And Madeleine founded some of the largest kind of like union organizations. They're still around today. So I knew her very well. Like I knew her from when I was born until she died, in my late teens. And Madeleine Parent, she was not a big government person, right? And nobody from her era was a big government person. So like she would organize workers against big corporations, but also big government oppression, right? Like her enemy wasn't just companies, it was all large organizations that were oppressing workers. And she was like a very grassroots person. That was kind of her approach. And that approach was very typical of the kind of like pre-boomer left, right? So kind of like the pre-war left. Something happened. I think it's, it happened all across the West and, across all ideological families where everybody started thinking that big government was the solution to everything. And, in a very real way, like that is the original sin of the NDP, which is like they abandoned leftism for big governmentism. And, I don't want to say it's like a NDP only thing. Like the liberals are like that. The conservatives kind of pay lip service to not doing that, but like they're also part of it. I think it's kind of like a moment in time that existed in the kind of like post-war period, and that's coming to an end now, thankfully. But I think for the NDP specifically, like that, like big governmentism and instead of leftism is the kind of original sin.
Well, I hope so, because it's who exactly told the NDP and the Liberals that the path to power was ditching workers and chasing downtown wine mom demographics, So, and I was talking to a labor lawyer the other day, and it was kind of interesting because we were talking about the working class, about how the Conservatives have captured it, and all they really need to do is say, like, look, we're not to the unions. They literally just have to say, we're not going to take your union rights away, but we're not also going to like add new rights for you. They literally just have to say, like, look, you're good. We're not gonna interfere with your trade, or not your trade deals, but with your negotiations. We're not going to enact 106, 107. Call out the corporations, because like essentially, like if we look at what happened with the the waterfront over on the west and in the east, and then the train unions, essentially what happened was that the corporations that own the train, CNCP, BCMEA over on the west coast there, I'm not sure who represents the east, but essentially what they did is they locked out the workers, and then they complained to the government that the economy is at risk. We're losing money. So you essentially can't have it both ways. You can't have it that you're going to lock out the workers and then go to the government and expect them to rescue you. That's not bargaining in fair. That's bargaining in bad faith. And the government really needs to call it out or stay out of it, one of the two. And I think the Conservatives need, if they wanted to capture the union base, they essentially just have to say that. But I also think that what you're saying is true, that there are special interests that are naturally associated with certain, political establishments. I suppose the conservatives would be their corporate entities. They've always had those locked in. So if they give them a nod to the unions, they might freak those special interests out. So let me talk to you about this. Jagmeet Singh talks about the middle class. Who is he exactly referring to? Because it sure as hell isn't welders or waitresses.
Yeah, so I just want to quickly point out that in the story you're telling, both the unions and the companies, and the company, they kind of assume or that the solution is government intervention, right? There's nobody that's like, or the unions and the workers, they should be, I think the workers do think this way, but the union leadership, they should say, the government is hostile to us, of course. The company is hostile to us, of course. We need to fight for our own rights. Like, why would you go and like want the government to intervene on your behalf? Like, why is that the default? Of course, you'd want the government to help you, but why do you assume that's kind of like the default course? And that's kind of this kind of like big government,
Sure.
Intuition that everybody has, or all the kind of like current leadership has. Like, younger people don't think that way, but it is a strange thing. So yeah, who does Jagmeet refer to when he talks about a working class or working whatever?
The middle class, because he doesn't.
Yeah.
He doesn't refer to the working class. The NDP abandoned the working class for the middle class 10 years ago. That is their slogan. So it's not working class anymore. It's the middle class. So who are they talking about?
What they're talking about is they're just reciting talking points that are just recycling what Jack Layton's communication team used to write. Right? Like, when I read their speeches and their their flyers and their website, their tweets, it really sounds like generic copy that we used to write under Jack. And it's like there's zero thoughtfulness put into it. There's zero meaning in it. It's just it's just like a chat GPT, like T type approach to everything, where they're just like, they like trained a chat GPT bot to like write in the way that the NDP writes, and then they just, or speak in the way the NDP speaks, and then they just apply that to every single situation without meaning a single thing. They don't care about the working class. They don't care about the middle class. They care about themselves and keeping their own jobs, and making their friends happy, so that they keep on getting invited to the cool kids table.
I want to just kind of touch 2 points about the union saying that the government wants them to intervene. From my conversations with union leaderships, and they don't want to be named, they don't want to go on record because they're afraid of alienating whoever is going to come in power, whether or not that be conservative and or liberals. But from my conversations with them is that they don't think that the government, they don't actually want government intervention. They want to be able to strike, put pressure on the companies, and they actually don't want government intervention. Right now, I think the waterfront unions, as well as CP and possibly the nurses union, are actually bringing this government to federal courts to fight Section 106 and fight the ministerial powers of the Minister of Labor. And I believe Stephen McKinnon was the Minister of Labor that enacted Section 106. And then those for you at home don't know what Section 106 is. Section 106 gives the government, or the CIRB, the Canadian Industrial Relations Board, extraordinary powers to settle not trade disputes, but settle labor disputes. The whole point of it was from the people that I've talked to, professors, is that they said that was to force both sides to come to the negotiating table. However, from what I'm hearing is that the companies are gaming this system. They're not even showing up to the negotiating table, and they're simply trying to run out the clock for the government to step in. So I just want to kind of make sure that we're straight on that. And it's kind of interesting because, the unions I have talked to is that, Jagmeet Singh is coming out to the strikes, but he's actually not really doing anything for the unions. He's essentially using the unions as props. But what's also kind of interesting is that We have the Conservatives actually meeting with the executive board members of the unions, but there's no press releases on that, which I also kind of find kind of interesting. So they're actually meeting with the executive membership, but they're actually not actually talking to them. So maybe they're getting ready for the election after the fact. But I find all of this fascinating, that you have such a hole that no party wants to fill. I mean, the NDP is trying to use the we're fighting for you, but at the same point in time, you have Section 106 being enacted. And what do? Well, they don't. What did Pierre Poilievre do before the break? He essentially used Jagmeet's own words, saying that you need to fight for the working class. And essentially 106 is Section 106. He held his feet to the fire. Where do you really stand on this? Do you have confidence in this government or not? And Jagmeet kind of blinked. He's like, oh, well, I'm not going to call out this government. So in my mind, it's about principle. Jagmeet has abandoned principle for politics. And I think that when he did that, he signaled to all of the middle class that I don't have your backs. So that's kind of funny, because it brings me to this next point, which is, you have these ads. Jagmeet, the NDP's latest ads, you've got Jagmeet, and it's really well done. I will give them that. I love the production value of these videos. But what the problem is you got Jagmeet fighting. Who is he fighting for? Because is he fooling anyone? Because for the last 9 years, all he's fought for is this Liberal Party. What are your thoughts on that?
Do you remember Michael Ignatieff?
Yes, I do.
And so for the viewers, it depends like how much they followed Canadian politics. Michael Ignatieff was one of the Liberal leaders under Stephen Harper. So when Stephen Harper was the prime minister, Michael Ignatieff was one of the Liberal leaders who lost against him. And the Stephen Harper's Conservatives had this attack ad against Michael Ignatieff, where essentially they're just saying like he's in it for himself, right? And it's kind of like, hey, this is like a guy a Harvard professor who came to Canada and ran to be Prime Minister of Canada because he wants to be Prime Minister of Canada. If he doesn't win, he's just going to leave and go back to Harvard. That was kind of their attack on him. She's like, he doesn't care about Canadians. He just wants, the fancy job title. And it was totally true. Michael Ignatieff, by the way, went to work for George Soros, heading up university that George Soros runs in Eastern Europe. So
of course he would.
Michael Ignatieff pretended this is not true, and we now know that was totally true. My point is, 100% of the leaders of the political parties today are just like Michael Ignatieff. That's true of Jagmeet Singh. It's true of Pierre Poilievre. It's true of Mark Carney. It's true of Justin Trudeau. It's true of Elizabeth May. It's just like, these are people who think that having prime minister or leader of a political party on their CV would look nice, and who want the glamour of being, some type of like small-time TV star. And that's what they're there for. And it's like, fundamentally, that's what's wrong with Canadian politics. Just like, it's just been taken over by Michael Ignatieff's.
And then that's I certainly hope that that's not true with Pierre Poilievre. You're probably right. I have hope that that's not the case. His whole goal was to become prime minister, and from what I hear, it seems like he has integrity, but I don't know. I mean, I fooled. I remember when it came down to the We Charity scandal, and I'm not a fanboy of Pierre Poilievre, but I have watched him since COVID, and from what he's done, it seems like he's been one of the few people to call out inflation, call out, that we're going to be hurting when all of this is over. Meanwhile, we have people like Mark Carney saying, well, inflation is transitory, don't worry about it. And he's the one, and Pierre Poilievre was one of the first few people that was calling out, higher interest rates, how this is going to hurt us. Look at our jet to GDP. People are going to be hurting. And look at it. We got people that are renewing their mortgages. We have, $500 million going towards or extra that's been spent towards homeless people. And we have a 12% rise in our homeless population this year. So I certainly hope that that's not the case. But I mean, again, when you're playing politics, you're playing a political tightrope. You've got to, satisfy your NGOs. You got to satisfy everyone. So, and I can't imagine what that's like. But talking about former leaders, we had Tom McClare come on the other day on CTV, and he basically said it's a two-horse race between liberal conservatives. What does that say about the Jagmeet Singh leadership, even when the former NDP leader is telling, your base, or not your base, but the NDP base, to ignore their own party?
I go door to door, try and convince people to vote for the NDP every couple days. Like I just walk around, go see my neighbors, and with the app that the NDP gives me, and I talk to them, and I say like, "Hey, you should vote for us. Are you going to vote for us?" And I've done this for several weeks, and I do it regularly. I think I'm the most active volunteer. Okay, I have found two people who say they're going to vote for the NDP. Where I live used to be an NDP riding, right? Like, and the people I meet, they're all people who say, I voted NDP in the past, but I'm not going to vote for you now. So I think the main thing that I'd say in response to what I didn't see this line from Tom, but what you're saying that Tom said
I kind of
is,
paraphrased it. He's basically saying it's between, don't vote NDP. It's between the liberals and the conservatives.
well, it's just true. It just is accurate. Like if in Hall Elmer, the riding that I'm in, which is a good NDP riding, if in Hall Elmer I can barely find anybody who intends to vote for the NDP. The NDP is just out of the game for sure. And by the way, I talked to other people who like head up, like important NDP riding, so where the NDP is pouring a lot of resources, and they find the same thing. Like they're not finding any NDP supporters when they go door to door.
So, look, you're on the ground and you're seeing this. So do you think McClare has, like, he's just saying what everyone is too afraid to say? Or do you think he's bitter? Because it could be two things. It could be he's sour because he's no longer a leader, or he actually might have a passion for his party. I mean, I'd imagine if you are a former leader and you are talking about it, you do have a passion for this party, and you could probably you're probably a little upset of where it's going. Do you think he's bitter, or do you think it's the latter?
I think his job is to be a commentator on CTV and to say the truth to the CTV audience, and that's what he's paid to do, and that's what he's doing. Like, it is 100% true that the NDP is, not in a good place.
It's funny that you say that, because when we have a former leader of the NDP and he is on the CTV and he is talking, and let's be clear, like, CTV is very left leaning, and it's very interesting that they have one of their commentators speaking in favor of Pierre Poilievre. He even went as so far to talk about the security clearance, and I thought this was very telling, because it's exact opposite of what Jagmeet Singh said. He said, Tom McClare said that if the Pierre Poilievre, which Mark Carney is criticizing about, is that he doesn't have his security clearance, and this is the same thing the Liberals have been saying for the past year. Pierre Poilievre doesn't have a security clearance. He's what is he hiding? And then Tom McClare, the former NDP leader, says, look, like, if he gets it, he can't talk about it. And that actually, he can't actually speak on those issues. And then that's actually a disservice as the leader of the official opposition. So it's it's very interesting that we have a left-leaning leader actually speaking praises about the conservatives. What do you think on that? Julien, are you there? Julien, you there? Julien, you there? Lost Julien here. Hi, we lost you there, Julien. So I'm going to edit out that part. So we just went from speaking about Tom McClare to him defending the conservatives. And
Can you hear
what
me
is that?
now?
Yes, I can hear you now. Can you hear me?
Yeah. I don't know what happened. I think maybe my mic was
anyways,
muted.
All good. But we're gonna go from left-leaning Tom McClure speaking on the behalf of Pierre Poilievre in terms of security clearance. I want to hear what your thoughts are on the security clearance, and I want to know what your thoughts on that we have Tom essentially endorsing Pierre Poilievre's position, because at the same point in time, we have Jagmeet Singh, who's actually gotten a security clearance. So Tom's actually doing two things. He's actually defending in my opinion, he's defending Pierre Poilievre's position, saying this is a good position to have as the opposition leader. At the same point in time, he's kind of throwing a little shade at Jagmeet, because Jagmeet's got his security clearance. So what he's actually saying is, look, Jagmeet's not a good leader. The NDP is not a good leader because they've done all these things. They can't talk about it. Meanwhile, we have an opposition leader who doesn't have a security clearance and can actually talk about it. And let's be clear, there are people within the Conservative Party that do have the security clearance. There are MPs that sit on that board that have their clearance and are able to look at what's going on. So I'd imagine if there is problems, they can actually talk to their caucus and say, look, like, this guy is no good, get rid of him, or they'll deal with it internally. But it's kind of disingenuous for the Liberals to say, well, Pierre Poilievre has a complete blind spot. So I want to hear what your thoughts on that are.
Yeah, so the first thing, I'll talk about the actual issue, but the first thing is, like, all this is just, different people taking advantage of lines that they think work in they test it in some type of focus group, and they think that works, right? So a lot of this is just politicking, and it's disingenuous. But on the fundamental point, it really comes down to how you see your role as a politician or as an elected representative of the people, right? A lot of politicians see themselves as part of the government. So they're like, I am part of the government. When I'm in power, I lead the government. When I'm not part of the government, let's say, or I'm not leading it. And that's kind of like one way to see it. The other way to see it is you are part of the people, and your job is to work against the government to make sure that the will of the people is taken into account by the government, right? And if you see things in that way, so if you think like, I'm here I'm representing Canadians, and I'm representing Canadians against their government to make sure that their government is not hostile to them, well, you're going to be very suspicious of this type of structure, right? So, like, if the government sets up some type of thing where they're only going to give you information if you set yourself up so that you can get sued, if you and held legally accountable if you disclose that information, that's a really precarious position to be in, because then what they can do, and what they do is they'll just tell you things that you already know that are kind of in the public domain. But then because they've told you, they can now sue you if you go out and talk about them. So, if you are, suspicious of the government, you see yourself as the enemy of the government on behalf of the people, then you would do what Poilievre is doing. If you see yourself as, an aspiring member of the government, you do what Jagmeet is doing. I guess it just depends on your point of view.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying, and I want to just touch a little bit about it, because I know what you're saying about politicking, but let's be clear. The Globe and Mail came out 2 days ago and said that CSIS says that India interfered with the leadership, the Conservative leadership campaign back in 2022. And Pierre did a masterclass on his responding on this. He said, look, like, if you go look at that same report, said that it didn't affect the end result. And at the same point in time, the Hogan query, it flagged it, again, said it was a nothing burger. But then he went and threw shade at, and I agree with you, he obviously there's some politicking involved, because he threw shade back at Carney, saying, like, look, this guy, you want to talk about foreign interference, this man is not disclosing, his $250 million loan with the Bank of China. And what are his conflicts of interest when it comes to that? Because again, this is a guy that's going to lead our country. Is he going to kowtow to China when, you know, there's a trade negotiation, or when it comes to them buying up our assets, our resources? Like, are we going to be infiltrated with China? So I just want to, I don't know if I want to make it clear, but at the same point in time, I want to say that these are talking points. They are being used by the mainstream media to attack our political, you know, and I would say that the Conservatives are probably the mainstream media's political opponent, because again, they've called out saying, like, we're not going to subsidize the media anymore, which let's be clear, 60% of the media wages are actually paid by tax dollars.
Yeah, it's crazy. That's like that in Canada. It's so weird.
It's anything under $80,000. Like if you're part of the mainstream media and your salary is $80,000 or less, 60% of that is subsidized by the Canadian federal government. And this is, and it frustrates me, and I imagine it frustrates a lot of the people listening here, because this is going to be one of the first elections where the mainstream media has a stake on who wins this next election. But I want to pivot a little bit, because, you know, I want to talk about Palestine, identity politics, and foreign distractions. And we're talking a little bit about foreign distractions right now, but I want to be clear, because, you know, I look at what the NDP is doing, and my main focus is to have a party that represents all people, not a certain section of people. And it seems like the NDP is focusing on just a certain little subsect of Canadian society. What do I mean by that? Well, Palestine, when we hear them talk about these issues, it's a very polarizing issue. I think it's a big mistake, because again, you may sit on either side of that. Maybe you side on Palestine, maybe you side with Israel. Either or, when you say that you endorse this brand, or not this brand, but this position, you're alienating voters, whether it's on one side or the other. I'm just curious, why is the NDP wasting oxygen on? And again, it shouldn't matter, because NDP is such a small group. They should be focused on Canadians, working class Canadians. Why are they worried about Palestine? Why are they worried about war in Ukraine? It shouldn't matter to them. They should be focusing on local issues, because they're such a small party. They hold, again, this is going to be a bloodbath for them, because they're polling in the single digits. But why is the NDP wasting oxygen on this? On global flashpoints like Palestine, when Canadians can't afford groceries?
Yeah, it's interesting. So when you're in government, I think it's like that in the US as well, but it's definitely like that in Canada. All the people, all the members of parliament, all the staff, all the ministers, etc., they're all really interested in these global portfolios, right? They want to be the Minister of Foreign Affairs. They want to be the foreign affairs critic. They want to be international trade, you know, that type of stuff that feels glamorous. When you go door to door and talk to voters, they're talking to you about potholes, right? They're not talking to you about, you know, global issues around Ukraine and blah, blah, blah. Like, it's even really difficult to get voters to engage on issues that the federal government can do anything about. Like, they mostly care about municipal issues. And there's this like disconnect between what kind of like, let's call it like elite people or people in the political system want to do, just stuff that feels high leverage and important. And then the things that voters want them to do, voters try to get them to do, voters need them to do, and just that is their job, which is to deal with real issues that actually matter to people. And, you know, so I think a lot of this is just, it's a lot easier to pontificate on, you know, what, on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict than it is to like sort out how would you, in actuality, truly reduce the cost of housing in Canada in a context where, you know, people own houses, they don't want the value of their house to go down, but then the new people are buying houses, want to be able to buy them affordably. Like it's a really difficult, complex issues that are, you know, not fun to deal with and hard to solve, and where you can piss off a lot of people, but that's your job. So I think a lot of it, just to wrap that up, is they just don't want to do their job.
Yeah. So let me ask you a question. So how do we get back to the NDP roots? How do we go from, middle class to working class? Because again, I think you've hit a lot of points, and I think I touched on it also, is that Canadians do not care about these flashpoint issues, especially when they can't put groceries on their table. And that's who the NDP should be representing, is they should be representing the people, the disabled grandma who's living on East Hastings, who can't afford groceries because she can't even get out of her apartment. Those are the people that the NDP should be actually focusing on. Instead, they're worried about these flashpoint issues. So what is it going to take, Julien? Let me ask you a serious question. How are we going to get back to a working class party that actually represents the working class?
So an interesting thing to note is that this is just like, there will be a complete shift in the Canadian political system, regardless of what anybody does in the next 10 to 20 years. The reason for that is that the boomers are all dying off. So like, the kind of like Diefenbaker era, governments, so like the pre-war governments and the people, in the 50s, they were very different than the kind of like Pearson to Trudeau era governments. Like, there's just like this moment in Canadian political history where it was like boomers, essentially, who, and there's a certain logic that made sense to boomers in the context that they were, in the way that Canada was, and probably maybe it was the right thing to do at the time. I don't know. I wasn't around. And that kind of mindset has been dominant ever since. It's been dominant since like in the 70s, 80s, 90s. It still is. But Carney is probably the last of the boomer prime ministers we'll ever have. I mean, I think he's technically not a boomer. I think the youngest boomer is 61 and he's 60. But he thinks like a boomer. But we're kind of like getting to the end of this kind of like boomer dominated era. And my generation and the younger generations are starting to take control. And so I guess what I'm saying is there's a tailwind to move away from the misguided and kind of like, I wouldn't say misguided, I'd say more like no longer works way of doing politics. And so it's just like there's a gigantic opportunity, and things will happen as long as people make them happen. So that's probably the most important thing. And in terms of the mechanics in the NDP, the NDP actually has a really robust constitution that makes it easy for the activists and members to have influence on what the party does. And there are many mechanisms that can be used. Right now, the NDP's true members are not really consulted or involved or coordinated or networked amongst each other. But that can change. And one of my goals is to change that and bring the true New Democrats together so that we can take back control of the party from these fringe, handful of people who think that, they're the boss for some reason.
I don't want to keep you. I know you got to go here, Julien. So I got one more thing to ask you. So, and I'm glad you talked about that, because I think it's actually time for someone to, and I think Pierre's doing it on the left. But again, I think what's going to happen with Pierre is he's going to alienate the working class because he's representing companies. Yes, he's unlocking, potential jobs, but at the same point in time, there's going to be a vacuum of people that are going to need representation that are working those jobs. And I think that's the role of the NDP. That's what the role of the NDP should be. So, is it possible for the NDP to have the next leader to run on a slogan, no more, or not slogan, but run on a jobs first principle, no more slogans, just working class jobs? And do you think the NDP leadership would ever allow someone, maybe like myself or a tradesperson who speaks how it is, to be their NDP leader?
So not yet. And I feel the political situation in Canada is not yet ripe for true change and a true correction, but maybe not the next leader of the NDP, but the one after that can be an actual real leader. Like the NDP is going to go through a period of, well, it's going to totally collapse. And then it'll go through a period of just like having to accept that they are no longer a real party. And then there'll be an opportunity to rebuild it. And maybe that'll be in 5 years, maybe it'll be in 10 years. Hopefully we can accelerate that. And I think it's in Canada's interest that the NDP pull itself together, and that it create a true working class alternative to the two establishment parties.
Julien, thank you so much. Where can people find you?
The easiest is Twitter. I'm just at Julien Newman on Twitter. I have a podcast that I do that has nothing to do with politics. It's entrepreneurship, and I do it with these guys, Reid Hoffman and Chris Ye, who wrote a very famous book called Blitzscaling. So that podcast, you can find it at youtube.com/@blitzscaling.
We'll have that in the show notes.
So if people want to or care about entrepreneurship, they can check that out.
I think people should care more. I watched it, Julien. It's great stuff. I think it offers a lot of lessons. And I think that one thing that this generation isn't being taught how to do is to fail. And I think that if people want to like be independent and they want to get into entrepreneurship, your podcast offers a lot of great lessons. And I think that one thing I'd like to impart on the people that are listening is that we need more people to fail. We need to be able to not be afraid of failing. And we also need a government that he's walked away from this, but I think it was a great line is that Pierre Poilievre said it, is people don't want a hand out. They want a hand up. And I think that what your podcast does is it offers people a way to actually accomplish what their goals are, especially in entrepreneurship. And there's a lot of, I've run 3 companies myself. It's a hard job. And if you and I didn't have valuable like mentors like you teaching me, I didn't have podcasts teaching me. So if anyone's listening, wants to learn about entrepreneurship, Julien's podcast is a great podcast to listen to. So my fellow Canadians, where does that leave us? We have a prime minister who won't disclose his finances, a party that claims to stand for the middle class, whatever that means anymore, and an official opposition being told to muzzle itself in the name of national security during an election. And then there's the NDP, once the party of the working people, the builders, the welders, the teachers, the nurses, the people who actually kept this country running while the elites wrote speeches about diversity and handed out contracts to foreign banks. Now it's pulling in the basements. Even Tom McClare, a former leader, is telling Canadians to pick between the red team and the blue team. Let me be blunt. That's not good enough. Canada doesn't need any more carefully crafted slogans. We need a party chasing the middle class while ignoring workers who can't afford groceries or rent. We need more of a movement that remembers who built this country and who is being crushed by the people running it. We need new leadership. We need courage, and we need to go back to the working class, because Canada's future will not be won in the boardrooms. And it sure as hell won't be saved by consultants or campaign strategists. It'll be rebuilt by ordinary people who've had enough and are ready to take this country back. Julien Newman, thank you for joining us today and for saying out loud what so many of us inside the machine are too scared to say. And to everyone listening, this isn't just a conversation, it's a turning point. We'll see you next time.